All right, so welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today, we're going to be doing something a little different.
Yeah.
As always, we have a really interesting source. And this one's really interesting because it's just a single phrase.
Uh-huh.
And it is
Okay.
create a podcast NEET class. So that's our source material today, just that one single phrase. And we're going to unpack it and see what we can learn from it.
Wow. Just a single phrase.
Just a single phrase.
That's going to be interesting.
It is interesting just on its surface level, like what does that even mean? So
Yeah.
maybe before we even get into what it means, just for anyone listening who's not familiar with the term NEET, that stands for not in education, employment, or training. So it's a classification for certain individuals. So yeah, what do you think when you first saw this phrase?
I thought it was fascinating because it's like a directive with zero background.
Yeah.
So we're sort of being handed this puzzle box, but we don't know what picture we're even trying to create.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes it so interesting as a deep dive topic, because when we first saw this, we were like, well, wait a minute. How can we possibly unpack this? And then we realized that the lack of context is really the interesting part. So, yeah, so like starting with the word create, like what does it even mean to create a class for this group of people? And then on top of that, to deliver it through a podcast, like is this a structured series of lessons? Is it more of a support group type of thing where people are calling in and sharing their experiences? Or is it just like a curated playlist of, episodes from different podcasts that are all focused on like, relevant topics? Like there's so many different ways this could be interpreted.
Absolutely. And I think the word class is really key here because, when we think of a class traditionally, I think of like a structured learning environment with a teacher and students and assignments and all of that.
Like a school.
Exactly like a school.
Right.
But in the context of a podcast, it could be something completely different.
Right.
Yeah.
It could be more like a community, a virtual gathering place where people can connect and learn from each other's experiences.
And I think it's also interesting to consider the target audience here because NEET is a very broad category. Like we said, it could include, teenagers who just graduated high school, young adults who are kind of struggling to find their career path, and even older individuals who might have, left the workforce for various reasons. So like their needs and their aspirations are probably going to be vastly different.
Right.
So like how do you create a podcast that speaks to all of those different groups of people?
That's a great question. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the format. If you have a solo host who's just offering advice, it might come across as preachy or one-sided.
Yeah.
But if you have interviews with former NEET individuals who are sharing their stories and their journeys, that might be more relatable and provide more practical tips for the listeners. And I think thinking about successful podcasts that already exist for niche audiences could be helpful too. Like think about Serial. It captivated listeners with its storytelling, right? Or stuff you should know. They thrive on just clear explanations of different topics. So which of those models would work best for a NEET class?
That's a good point. And I think it also depends on what the goal of this podcast is. Is it to help NEET individuals enter education or employment?
Right.
Is it to give them the skills and knowledge they need to thrive in this rapidly changing world? Or is it simply to create a sense of community and belonging?
Yeah.
The answer to that question is going to shape the entire podcast.
And then there's also just like the technical aspects of creating a podcast. You have to think about the audio quality. You need clear structure. You need a consistent release schedule. And then you have to think about what platforms you're going to use to distribute the podcast.
Right.
How you're going to promote it. How you're going to make it accessible to the target audience. So there's a lot to consider.
There is a lot to consider.
Even just from this one little phrase.
Yeah. And it really makes you think about the power of a blank slate. We've been given this goal, but the how, the why, the what are all wide open. And it forces us to confront our own assumptions about education, about purpose, even about the role of podcasts in society.
Absolutely. So listener, we've thrown a lot at you today. But now it's your turn to kind of dive a little deeper.
Yeah.
If you were going to create this podcast, what would it sound like? What topics would you cover?
Who would benefit?
Who would benefit? Yeah.
From listening?
We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely.
So until next time, happy deep diving.